I'm going to go back to living maths. That, again, is Steve Sherman, our colleague in South Africa, who has been a multi-year participant in the Humans to Mars Summit, but doing it from halfway around the world. And what we have is another of his terrific interviews that he taped remotely from his base in South Africa as part of the great work he does with young people in living maths. So we can go to that now.
I believe that humanity's destiny is in the stars.
Just getting to space is in fact the easiest part, because once you're in space, you actually have to live in it, right? And space wants you dead.
I have learned that through STEAM we can solve many different problems.
Altitude convergence, the radar has locked on the ground. Touchdown.
Let's say we are attacked by asteroids.
After our probe locates the asteroid.
You guys are here at a really exciting time. We're all talking about space.
STEAM is going to help our generation.
Want to go to space? Let's go.
We're going to be the new generation in Mars.
It's the closest chance to Earth we have in outside of Earth.
You'll have a colony that can grow and that can move mankind to another place.
Reach. Try the new. Experiment. Learn.
So we're going to use algae to clean the water if it ever gets dirty.
That is for our thorium reactor.
We had to use like actual research journals and like published papers.
At first, we didn't know about sulfur concrete at all.
We'll get it from other planets and then we'll purify it and then we'll divvy it out to everybody.
To have a truly thriving community, everyone is needed.
One of the first times we ever realized that there are no real borders was when we were in space.
If you try hard enough, you can accomplish anything.
Wonderful job, you guys. Everyone applaud everybody. And I'll see you next year.
Now you, go out there in that world. Go build something amazing.
So we are now live officially with Dr. Jancy McPhee, and you are by profession what? I mean, you've studied so many things. What is the actual profession that you go by?
So I have a PhD in neuroscience. So my story is that I was always interested in science and always good at it, but all of my hobbies were music and theater. Mm-hmm. So when I went to college and had to decide what I wanted to study, I tried to find something that would blend all of my interests together. So I chose neuroscience, which is the biology of thoughts and emotions and creativity and movement. So it allowed me to kind of put all my interests together. And then I became a laboratory research scientist. And I studied the cells and molecules that make your nervous system work. Mm-hmm. And parts of cells and molecules, very, very small pieces. And then I missed the big picture a little bit. So I went to NASA Johnson Space Center. And I used all that scientific training, but in a slightly different way. I used it to help coordinate international space life sciences research programs.
So what does that mean? International space science research programs?
Right. So it meant a couple of things. So the thing that I did the most was I tried to coordinate multiple sites around the world who wanted to do research together that was performed in a way that was standardized so that we could actually pool our data. So each site would be able to do, in science, we have to have things to compare our data to, and the data you get is more meaningful if you have larger numbers of samples that you have collected. So, but the research we were doing was very expensive and complicated, and so the idea was if each of the 3 different sites could do a third of the data collection, it would save each of the sites money. But in order to do that, we had to design our equipment and how we do our experiments in a similar enough way that we could actually compare and pool our data. So it was a lot of work, but I wasn't just interested in standardizing research. I was also interested in fostering collaborations so that we could, we're talking about space exploration is off the planet. But a lot of the groundwork testing is done here on the planet, and I think it's beneficial to get a diverse viewpoint about what is the best science, what needs to happen, what are we going to do while we're in space. So the work was largely about in-person human exploration, my work with NASA, and less about robotic exploration. So those were the kinds of things I was doing.
Interesting. And I mean, you were doing that how many years ago?
So I actually am still doing not exactly that work, but I do some work where I'm interested in thinking about kind of the next steps of space exploration. So I think that word is filtering out that we are many countries around the world are interested in going back to the moon. And we are going to go to the surface of the moon. We're going to go with robotic instruments and landers. And we're also going to try to go back in person. So the world is preparing to return to the moon and stay a longer time and live and work and build habitats and have an entire commercial economy and do a lot of science. There's a lot that we can learn, not just about the moon, but about our own planet and about the universe and our solar system by studying things from the moon.
Aha. There's obviously a commercial value to that information. So what happens to that research once you find it?
So a number of things. Yes, there is an important commercial aspect to that. And actually more and more of the government-led agencies are actually trying to figure out how to work more collaboratively, not just with other countries and agencies, but also with commercial entities who are interested in space exploration. So it's kind of a new model. And everyone is trying to figure out how to do that because historically it used to be that there were just a couple of very large space agencies and they pretty much ran everything. But it's very clear that more and more countries are interested in space exploration, and more companies are interested in, is there an ecosystem? Are there things that we can mine? Is there actually an economic structure, even just in the supporting of space science and engineering as we move further away off the planet? Now, obviously, there is already a space economy. We have satellites and, they communicate and take data. And, there are commercial entities that have worked with the International Space Station as it's been orbiting for more than a decade. And so there's quite a bit of economy already, but now we're entering the next level. And one of the things that we're interested in knowing is, can we live and work on the moon? Can we live and work on the moon and use it as a test bed to figure out how we will live and work and do science on Mars? And one of the big questions, for example, is how will we use resources that are on the surface of either the moon or Mars or another location? How will we use that to build the things that we need to get some of the things that we need to keep the human alive? And all of those different things are very interesting, and potentially there will be an economy associated with with identifying those resources and mining them and then turning them into useful products. But first we need to do some more science to understand exactly where they're located and how we will actually, test the technology to turn those raw materials into useful things. And it's really a wonderful partnership when agencies and commercial entities work together, because the more research we do, the more we know about the commercial possibilities, and the less risk it is for commercial entities to get involved. So it's a real partnership here that the world is trying to develop. And it's a very interesting new era of space exploration, and it's happening soon.
Probably sooner than most people think. I mean, within the next few years, we've been to the moon before. So as difficult as that task was back then, we are way more prepared. The equipment is better. The people are far more organized. Now we've got cheaper modes of transport that will get there quicker and probably a little bit more safer. So I do think that from a potential, a growth point of view, we're going to be able to obviously do a lot more. But so my question is, when we get to the moon, there's obviously a human aspect. It's not just the case of, can we find water, can we find rocks, and can we find certain things we can turn into resources that can be used? Do we take our own stuff with us? Do we become self-sustainable? I mean, are we taking a little module with us that we're going to live inside so that we don't have any issues, but we don't rely on the moon? But then what's the point? Why go to the moon if we're going to take a self-sustaining environment with us?
So you broke up a little bit there, but I think you're asking about the human aspect of basically space development and exploration. And it's a very interesting topic. There's a lot of discussion over what can be done robotically and what can be done in person. And actually, they're mowing the lawn. So if you hear a new buzz outside, there's a little extra noise, but it hopefully won't last very long. So I am very interested in the human aspect from a lot of different perspectives. So to start closer to the question you were asking, so there are still a lot of things that the human being is better at than the robots. And so that's an important aspect. There are a lot of discussions with my colleagues about, for instance, if you just think about lunar or Martian geology, how much can we do with robots remotely and autonomously? How many decisions need to be made in person by a trained human being? So there are a lot of advantages. And in order to support longer missions, we are going to need to develop the tools we need to live and work on the surface. And so we're going to need some sort of habitat structure. And, we've been living in space for a long time on the International Space Station, and there's been a lot of research about what is needed to keep the human healthy physically and emotionally and mentally as well. And we've made great strides there, but there will be more research required with each new environment that we go to, because each one brings a new set of challenges. Some of them are physical, some of them are emotional. So there's a lot of interesting research into taking care not just of the human body, but also the human behavior and welfare. And there are a lot of people who are asking questions. If we're really out in space for a long time, what are we going to do for entertainment? And what are we going to do to keep all the other parts of being human alive, like, the role of art on the interior of a habitat, the ability to make things creatively, the recreation that will be available. So we've had a lot of focus on being safe and healthy, and some on recreation, but there's even more research that needs to be done. Now, to move a little further away from your question, when I gave the introduction about sort of my formal credentials, I didn't tell you that during my process of working with NASA, I realized how important there were a couple of aspects that I'm very interested in. And you could tell that when I was a neuroscientist, when I chose to become a neuroscientist. But sometimes you don't understand your path and your journey until you're looking back at it. You don't always know what is influencing you along the way. You don't know what experiences are going to turn out to really affect you and be important. And therefore, when I talk to people, I always say, keep yourself open to broad experiences as much as possible. So the three things that I realized I was very interested in were, how do we communicate about space and all the underlying science and technology? It seemed to me, and I started thinking about these things about 10 years ago, it seemed to me that we could be doing a better job. So that was the first thing. So it's communication and education. The other thing that I was very interested in is, what is the process of being creative? We have so many future challenges in moving to the next steps in space exploration, but also we have future challenges in other science and technology fields as well. How can we address those challenges? How can we best prepare ourselves and our teams to work collaboratively to come up with those solutions? And then the third thing is, just because I think this is more based on my personality than anything, but I am very much the teaming queen. I am very interested in how we get different kinds of people to work together in an effective way to solve these challenges. So all of these things come back to our challenges, but I think those three different things, the communication, the creativity, and the teamwork, are three important elements that we could know more about and work on to prepare ourselves to solve some of our challenges. So I did start a nonprofit, but the work that preceded that nonprofit began while I was a scientist, and it basically was called the Humans in Space Art Program, and it involved using art integration techniques to help foster some of these things that I think are important. So the basic idea is we hold international multimedia contests about an important or interesting question about space exploration. And sometimes we're asking children to provide musical, literary, visual, or film artwork. Sometimes we're inviting young adults and early career professionals. Other times we're actually inviting professional artists or even professional scientists to create artwork about their work, so that we can weave this artwork into multimedia displays that then engage and inspire everyone who sees the artwork about the future of space exploration. So we touch the lives of the participant. We encourage them to learn the topic. So if they're a scientist or engineer, they learn to create something different and to look at their science and engineering differently and to become a better communicator. If they are an artist, we invite them to learn about space and contribute to the future and become invested in it. So it's a very broad effort to invite basically everyone to get more engaged in the future of space exploration, but also to prepare and train themselves to be better equipped to help us solve the grand challenges. So, sorry, that was a long...
No. That hit the nail on the head. So the real issue at the moment is that we are planning to go to Mars, but obviously it makes sense to first go to the moon and test out, the living environment on the moon before we go venture a little bit further down the line to Mars. But of course, it makes more sense to first try some things on Earth too. I mean, I know of a few what they call analog projects where people are putting themselves in extreme environments to see if they can survive under very difficult circumstances. And then obviously the moon would be a breeze without the breeze, of course, because there's no atmosphere. So, I mean, it would be so much easier to go to the moon if we've tested many of the different living environments on Earth.
Absolutely, and that is exactly what we're doing. So we have a lot of work that we do in the desert. We have work we do in caves. We have work in the Arctic and the Antarctic. We also have special facilities that are built to mimic being isolated from the outside world for long periods of time. We also have research that mimics the long-term effects of being in a reduced gravity environment. Interestingly, most of our scientific data, though, both on the Earth and in space, is the simulations mostly look at the effect of essentially no gravity on the human body, and we know what it's like to live on Earth, which is, a one gravity unit.
Mm-hmm.
But what we don't know is what it's going to be like to live on the moon and Mars.
1/6 of the gravity.
Right. Or 3/8, because we have no data between 0 and 1, except for some simulations that we have tried to do. And more people are proposing work to try to understand what would be the effects on the human body to be in an environment that's between 0 and 1, especially for a long period of time. And the moon will allow us to get a little bit of data, at least at 1/6 G. Will it be very much like living with no gravity? Or will it be very much like living on Earth with the gravity that we're accustomed to? We just don't know, because we don't know whether it's a straight line between 0 and 1, or a curve like that, or a curve like that. We just don't know how the plot will look between those 2 points.
Okay,
So
but
it's
now
very interesting.
you're going to be involved in the Humans to Mars Summit. And obviously at this particular event, there's a lot of discussion surrounding the trip to Mars, how we're going to live there. So you've obviously put a lot of thought into landing on the moon and doing the stuff on the moon. Do you also put a lot of thought into going to Mars?
Yes. So that is one of the important things that drives the quests for science and research, both for the humans and robotic and equipment. So it's a very important set of questions. But our most recently completed contest artwork is actually a suite of films and posters asking college and early career professionals to create the films and posters about what will it be like to go to Mars as the first humans. So all of those are online and available for display. So we actually have a huge suite of artwork just about Mars. So I am very equal opportunity in my interest in the questions that need to be explored. And I am also very interested in, as I mentioned, giving as many different kinds of people an opportunity to get engaged. And so by asking the public to create artwork, we are giving them an opportunity to really to share their views of what this future should be like, and to also feel a part of it, but they're also telling their story. And the topic of my lecture at Humans to Mars is actually going to be, why do we need to tell the story of the future of humans on Mars, and who is responsible to do that? And I will, not to, make it so that nobody needs to go, but basically I'm going to say that we all need to tell that story, because we all have something to share about that story. Everyone has a different human experience base. And I think it's an important thing. Everyone needs to get engaged. This is a next step for humans, and we are inherently curious, and we like to experiment, and it's very natural for this to become one of the most important things that we do next. It's just, how are we going to handle it? And for instance, you haven't asked this, but a lot of the artwork that we get basically asks the question, why are we going further into space when we have so many issues here on Earth?
And that's a very topical issue.
It is. It's very topical, and it's very important. There are a lot of questions like that need to be addressed. And the art form allows the why of space exploration better than our white papers and technical reports. And why is important. if we want to have support, if we want people to want to learn the skills to participate in this future, if we want them to vote for this future, if we want them to help us develop the technology and do the research, if we want them to tell our story in the newspapers and social media, we want them to paint the insides of our habitats or help us to live a full life there. The why is very important. And so it's a good question to be asking, and we have some answers, but it's important even just the act of asking the question.
Of course, I think once you build a natural curiosity and you start asking why, people then start finding innovative ways to answer that question, and sometimes that results in certain discoveries because the question challenged people on something that they took for granted. So that makes sense. Let's go back to 1969. A couple of guys landed on a big rock floating in space. If social media was around then and your arts initiative was around then, how do you think the story would have played out from a storytelling point of view? Because you're telling me it's so important to talk about the story of going to the moon and going to Mars and who's going to report it. We know about a situation where we went to the moon in 1969. If you'd go back then, how would you have reported it?
So I was alive in 1969.
No, I know that, but I'm just saying the project was running at that particular time.
No, it wasn't. I think that it would have been fascinating to have invited people to contribute their feelings and impressions of that time. A good example is there have been great efforts at many of our future space missions who have invited the public to get engaged in their missions. Curiosity, most recently New Horizons. There's a huge long list, and I'm not doing justice by giving you a broader perspective. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity. If someone wants to write a song about our return to the moon, or if someone wanted to write a song, landing on the moon made it into music. It was all over television. It was in eloquent speeches going forward. It was heard in the voices of the astronauts from the surface of the planet. So we had that 50 years ago, but now we have a chance for even more people to talk about the awe and the impact and how it makes them feel and why it's important and all of those different things. And we are trying to do a small part in that by actually, we have an open contest right now that is for anyone from around the world, ages 10 to 18, and it's called The Moon. It's about what will we do on the moon, and it's part of our Humans in Space youth art competition, and it's asking young people between ages 10 and 18 to create music and literature and film and visual art about what will we do on the moon. And it's open until the middle of May. So there's still lots of time for young people to work together, to learn a little bit about why we're going back to the moon, and think about their visions and their views and what impressions they would like to share through these creative formats.
Well, I will say this: if one is being creative, then one has to obviously explore certain scientific facts. If you're going to portray the moon or life on the moon, you can't just say, oh well, then we'll be pouring tea from a jug, because there's a certain science that says that's not going to happen. So what I do think is that sometimes the art can be inspired by the science behind it. So that's, it's a bit of a no-brainer. And that's pretty much why I want to lead into the next topic. And that is, right now it's very popular to have STEM education, the science, technology, engineering, and maths. And in the last, I'd say about the decade, people were talking about STEAM. And then afterwards, they went from STEAM, they switched into STEAMy or eSTEM, or they've given it all different names, but effectively they are talking about using the art within the science. And I'm very curious to hear from you your opinion on, putting art into the science and why schools are missing out if they don't include the art.
So I will start with a little bit of perspective as having been trained as a scientist, and I will also provide a little bit of data. So first of all, I think that the STEAM movement is fabulous, but I also think that it's a little bit of going back to the Renaissance. And I do think that's important because the neuroscientist in me, there's this very oversimplified idea that you're either left-brained or right-brained, and that's just kind of the way you are. And that is, there are definitely parts of the brain that are specialized for particular activities, but why would anybody ever want to only use half their brain? That just doesn't make sense to me. Plus, it's not really the way it works. In order to be creative, whether you're a scientist or an engineer or an artist, what you do is you pull on all the different kinds of experience that you have, your detailed knowledge and your broad knowledge, and you make new connections between that information. So everybody needs to be using their full capacity as much as possible. So by teaching young people to be good at only one or the other, some of it is by necessity, because you do have to specialize in order to contribute to the workforce in many cases. But my plea is to allow the broadness as much as possible. So by encouraging, for instance, if you look at our scientists and engineers, there's a big difference between a good scientist and a great one. And I believe that some of those differences are the other skills that we don't tend to teach in our science and engineering classes, like the ability to communicate, the ability to work well with other people, the ability to approach a problem in multiple different ways, using different mental devices and mental approaches. And I think those are very important skills to be really an excellent scientist and an engineer. Plus, I think that we tend to be a little exclusive and we don't invite people who have different kinds of training into our science and engineering problem solving. So we need to develop sensitivities between people to make them better team players. Oh yes, I'm going to work with that person. That person's an artist. I believe that they have something to contribute. I know that they use different words than I do. I know that they may approach the problem solving differently. But I have had some training and I understand and value that, and we're going to figure out how to work together. Similarly, the artist is saying, well, I don't think exactly the way the scientist does, but I respect and value that, and we're going to work together. I think there's a lot that we can do to allow a more collaborative problem solving. So I think inserting the A or the M or the Y or all the other letters into our education system is really just a general plea for don't be so narrow in what a student is taught. And within an art class, you can take on a science or technology topic.
Okay, sorry, I just had to mute there. All right. I know we've got some people who are watching it live, and we also have people who are joining us in the room over here as well. So we'll start with Mr. McNulty. Are you guys joining us for the rest of the session? If you are, do you have any questions? And any of the panel over here, Katrine and is it Rihanna? I'm not sure who else is there with us. You can just type in your names and then where you're from, so we can let everyone know who you are. I know we had Kiki from Greece, but she has left with her group. So Mr. McNulty, any questions from your side? You guys, are you a stream? Are you a STEAM? Are you a STEM middle school? What are you?
Well, you can hear us right now, right?
We can.
Excellent, good sound. I have a question right off the bat. I heard you talking about collaborative work, working together, the basic human skills that we don't always talk about. But this is a middle school. That's what we're all about. Can you give us an example of a project that your organization does that brings together that kind of teamwork, maybe a collaborative project of some sort?
So we are still fairly a relatively young nonprofit. So we are still working on that, but I do a lot of lecturing and workshops and training to try to develop some of those team skills. That's a much more in-person activity. And I also have a lot of colleagues that I work with as we try to develop what does it take to be a good team player. A lot of the international online contests have people who enter as teams. And so I know that a lot of teachers use our online contest as a model to actually practice team skills right there in their environment. So they will put together a team or have young people assemble their own team to take on one of these prompts for the international contests. And that allows them to really try to take on something that has a lot of different diverse aspects to it. And that brings to the forefront a lot of the training that's required. In order to be a strong team, you need to have empathy for where other people are coming from, where their ideas are coming from. You have to communicate in a language that takes into account the priorities and the way other people are talking. You need to be resilient when your idea is not always the one that's selected by the majority of the team. There's a lot of things that get practiced by doing those team activities.
I mean, that's an incredibly valid point. I see it. You do have another question. We'll come back to you, Mr. McNulty. Katrin, do you guys have a question there in Germany? You can just unmute yourself.
Yes, not at the moment. We are just listen to the interview. Maybe later.
Okay, that's no problem. No problem.
Okay.
And I think we have a guest from Russia. Do you have a question that you want to ask? We have no response yet. Okay. We'll come back to Mr. McNulty. You want to ask another question?
By the way, I didn't introduce, but this is Holland Middle School. We're in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. And our questioner's coming up. He's going to introduce himself in a minute.
So I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Oh, really? Where at?
Just north of Philadelphia.
That's us. Yeah, we're in Bucks County near Newtown, Doylestown, that whole area. All right, now go ahead.
I grew up in Tottenham.
And I have a question. Do you think Elon Musk will use this art research to find a way to Mars?
Can you ask the question? You broke up.
Do you think Elon Musk will use this art research to find a way to Mars?
Will Elon Musk use art research to find a way to Mars?
Could he be inspired by maybe students who develop a way to get to Mars, and then they create rocket ships in their imagination, and that inspires him to create something that most people would say it can't be done?
So the question you're asking is so Steve already mentioned how science and technology inspires art. But the larger question of what you're asking is, how does art inspire science and technology? And so we didn't talk about that flip side. And so you're right on target. You're being very specific in your question, because Elon Musk is definitely a personality that everybody knows. Mm-hmm. He's also extremely engaging in many ways. And I would argue he's already using art. When he sent that car, Spaceman, Rocket Man, whatever he was named, into space. So he's already engaging in art and allowing this to inspire what he wants to do, and to use it as a tool to inspire others. But the larger issue is just, how does art impact science? And I am really fascinated in that topic because I'd like to see it happen in a more concrete way. But we definitely have obvious examples where, first of all, art is a fabulous communicator. And, you know, policies, public opinions, voting, all of that can be well communicated through art, and that includes advertising. You know, whether it's music or film or posters or things that you see. But I think that Steve was already mentioning that a lot of times what happens is there are ideas out there that are not reality. And so you can't just go out and take a picture and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You have to turn these nebulous ideas from the brains of the one person or the team and turn them into something that everybody can relate to. So a lot of times that will be, for instance, a visual concept. And one of the people who has really helped us along the way was a fairly well-known space artist who actually worked in an engineering company. And he would sit in on all of the technical discussions, and he would actually capture through visual art a lot of what was being proposed around the table. And it was fabulous because a lot of times it wasn't exactly what they were thinking, but by seeing it conceived, it kept the dialogue going, and sometimes something is visualized in art that then strikes an idea in a scientist or an engineer. And just going back to the work that I started to talk about that I used to do internationally, the topic that we used to look at was whether or not we should have artificial gravity on long duration space missions, because we don't know what will happen for really long periods of time without gravity, years and years and years. So there are a lot of different ways to generate gravity. You can spin someone in a small centrifuge for a couple of hours a day, or you can spin the entire spacecraft. And we have never had an entire spacecraft like that spinning. And so whenever somebody wanted to talk about it in these scientific meetings, they would clip out an image from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had been made decades before, because the best portrayal of that was actually from a movie. So these are interesting things. It's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say, I mean, not only is it a great question, but the reality is, if you guys go back to your Netflix and you pull a series, you probably never heard of it, it's called Star Trek. And Star Trek is a series that people that my age might be able to relate to, where they had these things called aliens and rockets, and they even were able to move people from one place to another using wizardry in science. But what has happened is that, you know, when you look at the way they communicated with their little flip, what they call the flip communicators, I mean, those are replicas of the old Motorola cell phones that are now so old, we don't even consider that as technology anymore. And what we have noticed is that science fiction has become science fact. And that's because of the creative minds of the people who put together the Star Trek series. So now what I've noticed is that in the old days, people used their creativity and they put programs on. Nowadays, they are so focused on accuracy that they don't take creative license enough. And that means that, yes, if they are going to portray a ship, they are going to try and portray a realistic one, and they're not going to think too much outside of the box, because people are going to go, oh, that's so unrealistic. And already when I interview astronauts and I interview people from NASA and from ESA, they will always tell me which aspects of the movies were unrealistic. But the reality is that sometimes we need that whimsical, outside of the box thinking to inspire people to say, you know, that's not possible, but something that is similar is. And let's maybe look at that. I mean, when people watch rockets flying off and then they would come and land in the ocean, along comes Elon Musk and says, why don't we get a vertical rocket to land back on The launch pad, I mean, that was just the most insane thing. And if you actually picture a vertical rocket, and you're thinking, how do you control this thing to actually land vertically? It's mind-blowing. But yet he managed to do it. And I think it was based on some of the creative things he might have seen. So it would be very sad if we only had accurate portrayals of where we are going. And of course, we haven't been to space, to Mars yet from a human point of view. So yes, there will be some creative license. And already we've had a couple of movies that are a little interpretive of, the storms, the dust storms that we have. We've had Jim Green, the chief NASA scientist, tell us that no, the dust is so fine that you wouldn't even know the dust was going over you if there was a dust storm, and it wouldn't be like in the movie with what was it called? It was called
The Martian.
The Martian. There we go. With it'll come to me. I can picture his face. You know who I'm talking about? Yes.
I do. I can't remember his name right this minute either.
It's that time of day. But what is fascinating is that, we do need that kind of creativity to spark ideas. And the group wasn't here, Ms. McNulty's group was not here earlier. But can you just tell us a little bit more about this organization that you run? Maybe give us a little bit of context in terms of the history, and then tell us about some of these art competitions that these students can take part in.
Okay, so as I was explaining earlier, I was a scientist at NASA, and while I was there, I really felt that we needed to do a better job communicating about the future of space exploration and getting everyone engaged in that future. So I was actually on the scientific planning committee for an international space research meeting, and it was a difficult time. It was very much a transition time for space exploration. The shuttle was going away, and everyone was thinking about the next thing. And so the science planner said, let's make it the next golden age of human spaceflight. And somehow this was a light bulb moment for me, just like out of the movies, when I felt like we really needed to engage those who were going to carry out that golden age. So it's those of you in Holland Middle School right now are the ones who are actually going to carry out that future. And if we don't engage you in some way in that future, you're not going to prepare yourself and you're not going to be interested in contributing. And so I needed a common language that could create a dialogue across the generations and across the national borders. And so I selected art. And when I say art, I mean multimedia. So it's music, it's films, it's literature, it's visual art. And that was the first Humans in Space Youth Art Competition. It was held in Houston. Then a couple of years later, we did something similar, and it wasn't held in Houston. It had a live performance event when the contest was over in Houston. Then we did it again when the German Space Agency was running this international meeting, and they also wanted to reach out worldwide and engage young people in the future of space exploration. So it was clear that it was a decent model. It was at the appropriate time. It was timely in this interest in developing more than just facts and analytical skills, but also the abilities of people to be better communicators and more creative. And it was also the right time in space exploration. So that was the Humans in Space art program. And about 7 years later, I spun that work off to be managed under our nonprofit, SciArt Exchange. So that's at SciArtExchange.org. And we are now continuing to hold international contests about the future of space exploration and to weave all